on an ERC project, Leibniz Dream. I think we'll be hearing something about the Leibniz Dream project in Uli's talk, and also a little bit about what he and I are working on together later on, but that's for later on. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Uli. Actually, a couple notes. The talk will be 35 minutes. I believe there's going to be some comment about how we're timing this exactly.
Yes, yeah, I forgot about that. Indeed, we have a gong to just let you know that you are 30 minutes in the talk. Lucy, can you exemplify? Okay, yeah, it works. So that would mean 30 minutes in the talk and then a second one for the 35 minutes. So just time to wrap up so that you leave time, enough time for discussion, like 25 minutes or 30 minutes. It's up to you how you want to monitor your time. But yeah, in order to encourage ample discussion, let's try to keep it to the...
So 35 minutes roughly planned for the talk itself, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. What I'm going to suggest for the questions is, rather than the hand raise feature in Zoom, which I find very confusing, that anybody who would like to ask a question, please type Q in the chat. And we'd especially invite junior researchers, so PhD students or junior postdocs, to type in, to indicate that by typing in Q Junior, and we'll give, if there's a choice, we'll give preference to junior researchers in picking questions. All right, so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Uli for his talk on socio-emotive meaning and logical meaning from a meaning first perspective. Uli?
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction, and thank you, Michaela, and for organizing this series of workshops. I've learned a lot already, and I'm sure I'll learn more today. So now I start sharing my screen, hopefully. Slides. Can you all see? Good. So this talk is on trying to architecturally explain the kind of division that we have in meaning between socio-emotive and logical meaning. So in okay, so it's been much discussed in social linguistics that that there are often different variants that associate that are used differently. So for one of these prototypical examples there is English gerund in pronounced either as "thank you for coming," or so that's a bit sort of more formal and has various. I mean, I'm not a native English speaker, so I probably don't quite carry this. But then, in difference to that, the "thank you for coming," where there's just where this is somewhat reduced. The ending, and which is more casual and perceived to be more or less aloof, or more in various ways more different from the other one, and there's sort of some gradient difference between those two. And this type of meaning difference, which is now described as in the domain of social meaning, has been usually regarded as separated from differences in sort of referential meaning or logical meaning in social linguistic research. So basically the assumption there is that this is some other dimension that is you can best observe, at least if you have referential or logical equivalence, as we do have in this case. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Well, logically equivalent. And one other property that we'll come back to is that it kind of relates more to the sound of the meaning, and I mean I can't quite I put here a quote of Eckert and Labov. I'm not really sure I fully understand that what they intend to express here, but that it sort of goes to, it's more attached to the sounds and than the logical meaning, which I don't know what the phonological structure does here essentially. And there's a question though that I don't think has been addressed much. There's some work that I have listed at the end by Andres Saab, unpublished work. Is kind of, why do these two types of meaning differ as they do? Why they exhibit different behaviors in various ways, and but the sort of treatment in work that tries to treat them in the same in a general theory of meaning is usually that, well, you put double brackets for the Montagovian interpretation function around these and assign some kind of model theoretic concept, and that maybe want to consider that. So, but I've arrived at this sort of from a different perspective of how grammar should be structured and what the role of meaning and grammar should be. That I, in joint work, in particular with Artemis Alexiadou, and we call this a meaning first approach. And I want to first introduce that briefly, and that sort of puts these issues in a slightly different light. So I'm quite sure that it's so important. So the place this other perspective starts is kind of, or diverges from mainstream formal linguistics, is concerns the issue of how are complex thoughts generated, and there the standard approach assumes that this is in the language, and the sort of best reference for this, so this is widespread, this assumption in the field, is work by the cognitive scientist Liz Spelke, who says that, well, this is, it's a composition of semantics of natural languages that allow children to sort of go beyond sort of domain-specific concepts that they have maybe in innate physics and innate other systems, that cognitive systems, and combine these repertoires from different cognitive systems of what Spelke has called core knowledge, to form new concepts, and that these complex new concepts that allow kind of the human to or like the adult to be exhibit a more differentiated behavior than the more planned behavior than the child, but it also puts a divide between the humans and other species possibly. And in linguistic work, I mean, this is very compatible, and actually linguists love this Spelke work a lot, and I used to too. And I mean, it's an inspiring claim, and it fits right in very well with the so-called T model of grammar that is mainstream generative grammar, where there is an operation called merge in the that generates complex expression, and that's a core syntactic operation. And then these complex representations kind of that are generated in the syntax serve to sort of give you some kind of thought or complex concept, and also lead you to an articulation of a sentence. And this is a very popular model, but one prediction of this that might be problematic is that it sort of predicts that animals should never have any, or like without language, so that would be animals, I guess, you would never have any complex thought. And so more recent work in animal cognition might cast some doubt on that. And I have one example of that here. My favorite example. So this is a New Caledonian crow in a lab in Oxford. And what you see is not trained behavior. So you there's food hidden in a small bucket at the bottom of this clear tube here. And the crow has a aluminum, I think, rod in its beak and is trying to get this tube out of there, to get out of the water. Now it had an idea of changing something about this rod, namely it bends it into a hook, and now it goes easily. Now it manages easily to get to the food and this, I mean, and the straightforward explanation from my perspective for this would be that while the crow is formulating at some point at this moment when it pulls out the rod from the tube, this conditional. If the rod was bent, I could pull up the bucket, and then it executes basically this plan. And in animal cognition, the debates and other works that about this and whatever, but at least it raises a possibility that the complex thoughts are present, the likelihood that complex thoughts are present independent of language, even in crows, or the New Caledonian crows at least. So then what do we do with our model of grammar? I mean, then we have to write Bullen and say, well, to some extent at least complex thoughts are generated independently of language. So we have some generator, and that gives us a thought. And then this, in some way, there's some work in linguistics that has tried this approach, particular here, Hock and Lewel and Jackendorf. And the next question is, well, then, yeah, one question is, why hasn't this worked so well, this type of model? And I assume that we assume that it's mostly because then, like, the assumption is that the thought is just sort of one-to-one mapped to an expression, to a complex expression. And in our approach, we assume that possibly is not the case. So you might think that these thoughts, they are the crows can't articulate them. So this articulating them, at least not to my knowledge. So this articulating a thought might be rather a complex process, and that it wouldn't be if it's just a one-to-one mapping of like one concept to one sound. And also, if these thought representations are already present independent of language, they might be optimized for considerations other than communication. And then communicating them would be some kind of afterthought, but possibly they're like in a computer, you have internally files that are very large maybe, and then when you want to send them by email, you compress them with you zip them or whatever you use as a compression tool. And something like that might also be taking place in human communication. So we assume that there's a compression or compressor that compresses kind of these thoughts as much as possible in the process to articulation. And ultimately, this kind of compressor would be kind of taking into account how well you as a speaker, care about how close the hearer comes to understanding your meaning and how effortful the articulation is, and on these considerations you sort of weigh against each other, maybe in some kind of probabilistic game theoretic model, and let's see, leads to the articulation. But in a kind of caricature picture, you could think of this way, that there's some very complex thought representation with many different concepts here. Some of these maybe look like what you find in a formal semantics paper, and out through this sort of funnel of compression comes something, then come just two words. Actually, side of the screen is always covered for me, but why not? And then the hearer, because the hearer kind of has the same principles of forming thought representations in their mind, is able to more or less reconstruct something that comes close enough to the original thought in some fashion. This is still science fiction, so I can't do this example. I'll do a very simple example that sort of illustrates them in more fine-grained technical detail what I have in mind. So we have here, this is some kind of a thought representation. Now, given here with words, but these are meant to be all non-linguistic concepts. So we, and then the present tense, and like linguistics. And there might be two ways of articulating the present tense, namely you just don't articulate it. That might be restricted to environments where you're kind of next to a verb. And the other one would be to articulate it with the auxiliary do. And well, then you have two possible articulations, namely we like linguistics and we do like linguistics. But the first one is clearly more compressed, and so that's the preferred one, or that's the one you choose. The other one would be blocked normally. Now there might be, yeah, and that's kind of what we find more or less in English. Now sometimes though people do say we do like linguistics, and one way of accounting for that within this kind of theorizing would be to say, well, that's really a different representation where you maybe have something like a focus feature on the present tense in addition of a focus concept here, and that then prevents you from fulfilling this environment condition of the null realization of the present tense, of leaving it out, and then you would get we do like linguistics. So that's a simple, graspable, concrete examples of how this is supposed to work. But of course, here in this example, these components might well be, definitely these like we and like and linguistics might be much more complex concepts in themselves and are not taken to be primitives. I mean, present tense might be a primitive or maybe not be. No, but this is just for illustrative purposes still. Okay. Now, so we have this model architecture here, which looks pleasingly simple. There's a generator that gives you some kind of non-linguistic thought, some kind of complex logical representation, and then you compress it into an articulation. And there, in a paper that Artemis Alexiadou and I published last year, we talk about a number of arguments for this, and there's one extra actually here listed here. So one is sort of the just observation that language is very logical, and I mean, constituency is kind of one of the properties of one of the ways in which language is logical, but there are other considerations, so that kind of which I'm not going to go into in much detail, but sort of that equivalent representations, or really logically equivalent representations, stand in some kind of relationship where they block one another, or at least the more complex one blocks the other one. Then there is the idea that like these compressors might be different for languages. So then you could get that can account for, to some extent, for the differences between languages, that they pronounce different parts of a structure. And then idea that there's under compression, especially in children. So in children, sometimes you find extra words in what they say, and you find them sort of systematically and across languages. You wonder where they come from, and that could be that they don't quite know how to compress as much as English. That's what we mostly pursue currently. And finally, there's could be then also cases where you have two, like one thought representation a speaker has in its mind, but especially multimodal speakers who can talk both in a spoken modality and a signed modality, can then apparently articulate these independently in the two modalities in parallel. Okay, so that's sort of the model that is in the background. And now the socio-emotive sort of communication doesn't quite kind of fit into this. And this is what, and like if we just say, well, I'm cool, is the same as what you see here, being dressed in a cool way. But it really behaves very different. I mean, this I'm cool, that feels not. I mean, it's not as immediate or not as authentic in some way. I mean, wouldn't convince anybody if I just said I'm cool, but maybe I could convince somebody by dressing in a cool way and getting my hair done or whatever. And this also kind of is something that I mean, just you probably have other cognitive systems than this logical system of forming thought representations, and these evolutionarily probably are involved in communication somehow earlier. So looking this up, I found that there's here the a monkey that is in the researchers found that this is like the Brad Pitt of monkeys, and he seems to here also by his pose be, to me at least, I mean, communicate that he's cool, and also to the females of his clan. Apparently, yeah. And I mean, in other animal communication, like especially relating to mate choice, these kinds of communication seems to be very important. I mean, and I don't know what they like, the peacock's tail and whatever they pay attention to, but it also plays some role. So with this inspiration now, I mean, we look at examples where in language where these systems might then be sort of interfering with one another, and that's, I think, sort of what we want to, the perspectives that I want to kind of articulate here. So this type of meaning, which I call here socio-emotive rather than just social, it seems to have some properties that sort of make it act independently. So one of the well-known examples is the work by Potts here, that and Potts et al. That in certain sort of structures that require meaning parallelism, this meaning parallelism only applies at the kind of to the logical component. So I'll talk to the president and the president alone in this kind of construction. These meanings of the two occurrences of presidents are the same, and you can change just one of them with this kind of socio-emotive thing. So you couldn't say a president or something, or to honor maybe, or put a emoji there, or you can insert goddamn or some kind of other derogatory term, but you can't insert something. I'll talk to the American president and the president alone, or use some other description as Pottedal report. Even an example that someone know plays a role in the letter is from our work, which is based on work by Gutzmann, especially the German word Köter, which is kind of like cur, but it doesn't have this mixed breed meaning really, at least. It could be a purebred dog that I refer to as Köter, as long as I mean it in a derogatory way. So there's a normal word Hund for dog, and then this derogatory term Köter. And this also in other, like ellipsis is another structure where only the logical meaning seems to be relevant. So you can see this here. It could be that the dog hater says, I saw your Köter, so the derogatory term in the park. And a dog lover then asks back in which, and that doesn't then imply that this dog lover now became a dog hater or something. So that part of the meaning of Köter in there. So if you spell this out, it would be in which park have you seen my dog, rather than in which park have you seen my Köter. Yeah. So these meanings, according to this, you see this property that this socio-emotive meaning is really tied to the pronunciation of the morpheme here. Okay, so and these properties, yeah. So another property that you have that they are negatable generally, or so I didn't see a damn dog is different from I didn't see a red dog. So the redness here could be negated, but the dislike of dogs can't be. Yeah, it disappears in ellipsis. We just saw that. And so the explanation in this model, we sort of try to develop a bit, is I want to discuss this with you, is that these kind of feelings really here as some kind of, I mean, here you have sort of the logical meaning, and here you have the feeling, and that kind of so the dislike of dogs, and that kind of comes in this compression process. I mean, that might also help us understand this compression process better and articulate that better within this model. So we have a very simple formal mechanism at this point. You assume that some of these forms, so the pronounced forms, are mapped, and when they are associated with specific emotions, either to 1 or -1, and so the default would be 0. So Köter, this German derogatory term for dog, would be mapped with disgust to 1, but with formality or something to -1. So it's rather informal. Whereas Hund is kind of neutral. It's a 0, 0. And that's sort of the. And then the assumption is that you kind of, the speaker is in a specific state when they pronounce this word. So particularly related to the concept dog then at that point. They just somehow try to get as close to their state with the expression that they use. So, I mean, there are many different ways probably of modeling this. And so, and then if they are in a sort of normally formal state, but the disgust state is present, or disgust is present, then they use the word Köter. And the same speaker, if they perceive themselves to be in a more formal situation, might use Hund. So the non-derogatory word. Okay. So the sort of mechanisms involved in here is that there is some, I mean, that is predicted that there's, I mean, some kind of, generally in these cases, some kind of blocking, and that's something that Adler and Smith already in to do. So thank you for listening. One of them might be blocked because it's informal or yeah, something. And in particular, that might also be useful for polite pronouns. So I give here some English example, but my Shakespeare is not so up to date. So the German example is you use generally the plural, third person plural pronoun in a polite setting because the do is marked as kind of informal or has some other meaning components that would block it. Maybe there's a second person singular, and then the third person plural is kind of the fit all anywhere pronoun across languages, and that's why it would come in then. So you've almost made it to the end of this talk. So I didn't hear the gong yet, but so maybe I'm going too fast. And then another, I mean, not quite so fitting so well really here maybe is this insertion that you get with, like, for example, goddamn, expressing the disgust for the goddamn dog or something, or dislike or whatever that is. And you would to assume that I mean the word dog itself is 0, but by inserting goddamn in English, you kind of have a way of kind of like with Goethe of expressing some of this disgust, and that gets you closer to your target expression, and that's why speakers then can insert goddamn or I mean in German there's a similar expression or like verdammt, and that actually very frequently co-occurs with the use of Köter, which by dog dislikers. Yeah. Oh, finally they go. No, I'm went a bit too fast, maybe. Okay, but I'm at the conclusions already. So the what I try to argue is that maybe this, I mean, so this we take this well-established division between socio-emotive and or social and logical meaning seriously. That I mean is widely established in social linguistics, and we want to look for some way of explaining it. And this is particularly an acute problem maybe for this meaning first type of model, because there's the only other way is to say, well, everything is present in the logical meaning. So we really needs kind of this second interface between some kind of meaning like system and language to get something other than logical meaning, to get something sort of more immediate, to capture the character of these socio-emotive meaning. And so, yeah, then the proposal is that it comes in at this sort of second meaning language interface during the process of compression in ways that we have only begun to understand here. But that would predict these, at least these division between logical and socio-emotive meaning that the social meaning social linguistics literature finds. Well, yeah, I mean, I can't quite address this in competent detail because but there is sort of related work. So this might not depend so much on I mean, it doesn't really depend on the meaning first model. It's just that in standard models, people see only, usually assume only one interface between language and meaning. But I mean, there's sort of in the more mainstream grammar architecture work. There's work by Andres Saab from Buenos Aires, that develops a kind of similar model that, yeah. Okay. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Uli. So we have almost half an hour for questions, 37 minutes, I think, and 27 minutes, sorry. And again, I would just ask that anybody who has a question type Q into the chat, and you can add JR to the.
I better stop sharing, right? Or what's the custom? I actually couldn't be here yesterday because.
Doing.
Yeah, it's better. It's better to stop sharing.
Okay.
You may want to share.
All right.
Questions.
Yeah, I did it. Okay.
Questions. So we have a question from Tatiana.
Yes, thank you. I'll ask a question. So thank you, Uli, for the talk. It was really interesting. I don't know if I understood everything right, but if I understand correctly, then the logical meaning under this approach is still kind of primary before the social meaning comes in, like when you start to choose the expressions, if I understood correctly. And I was wondering about cases like this Köter, right? This German dog, where there are also uses where you can kind of lift this negative connotation to the actual logical content, right? So you can say something like, I don't know, Maria's dog is a real Köter or something like that, right? So you put it in this place where it's now actually that is the main logical content of what I'm saying, is that it's a bad dog, right? What do you say to? I mean, first question is, did I understand the model correctly? And the second question is, like, how does this relate to cases like this?
Answer to the first question probably is yes. I mean, at least as far as I can diagnose. I mean, the question you ask is a good one. That's the second one, so I assume that therefore the answer is yes. Yeah. I mean, I haven't thought about that type of example. I mean, yeah, at this point, really the primary mechanism would be that it's some form of quotation, which, I mean, we would have to put into this model anyway, though we didn't talk about it. And someone lost you on the screen now. There. And I mean,
Okay, but generally, if I can just follow up, I didn't want to interrupt you, but generally, you would assume that something like this shouldn't normally happen, right? So there should be no interface between these two parts other than in the one direction, that you kind of enrich the logical content with the social content, outside of these quotation type examples.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the conclusion of I mean, both social linguistic research and this work on expressives, as far as I can tell, that they behave in this way somewhat uniformly. I mean, there's I mean, at this point, I'm not sure whether there's like a systematic sort of comparison, say, between like some pronunciation variant, whether I say nicht or nicht or something in German, or like the coming and coming in English, and these more like these types of examples that are discussed more in the expressive literature. I mean, the initial work on this by, isn't her name Smith as well, but a different Smith from the one I cited from like the Midwest somewhere. Like the like there was some work that kind of did go through some of Potter's tests with just like different pronunciation of yeah, thank you, you did, yeah, Alan Smith, right. And so the other one is James Stewart, the one that works with David. There, I think there's a classification. It's just that it's basically the conventional implicature type of meaning, and so they, yeah, and that's sort of where my knowledge of this. That's the most systematic comparison that I know of. So yeah, that's and that's yeah the assumption here. I mean, if there's differences, then at this point they would not be predicted by the model. Yeah, I would say.
More questions?
But
oh, sorry. Do we have more questions? In that case, I think I'm going to jump in and ask a question myself, if I may. So the example you've used is a case of sort of clearly emotional meaning, so dislike of dogs or disgust or something like that. And I'm wondering how you might extend this to other cases of social meaning that are less clearly sort of emotionally based. So I'm thinking of for example, of the sort of examples that Heather Burnett discusses of Obama using the come and workin' variant in a situation where he wants to signal that he's a likable regular guy, and the coming working variant in a situation where he wants to signal that he's a competent individual.
Yeah, good question, of course. And I mean, because this model is kind of a toy model, and you're supposed to be the kind of child that wants to break the toy. Yeah, and I mean, so in this case, I mean, there's sort of this. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of. I mean, this is similar to the property formula which I have in the head of the model, but I mean, the effect is much more gradient in this data by Labov, that in the speech in Parliament, in the, what is this called, in the Congress, yeah. Is what you call it, yeah. Then he uses still like about 10% of the time Obama used the invariant, and at the barbecue he's still, and there's a proportions are reversed, but there's still some residue. So I would think that, yeah, I mean, maybe I can, this makes this all more probabilistic. And, but I mean, then still have this, I mean, that would apply it to sort of this matching between the, like, when you have the choice between the two forms, and like you look at this, like, yeah, that would have to be made somewhat probabilistic, but it could still be that, I mean, I have a dimension of, you know, multiple dimensions of like formality and, yeah, sort of aloofness versus casualness and warmness, or ordinary guyness, or whatever Obama wants to be expressing at the barbecue. And then I think once there's sort of some probabilistic component added, I don't see a problem, or is there something beyond that?
No, I don't know. I don't know that there's a problem. I'm just sort of wondering, is because that doesn't seem to, it seems like it also belongs outside of your meaning first, your basic meaning first architecture, but it's also not rooted in my sort of primitive emotional reactions to dogs or whatever. It seems to have sort of more, potentially more, I don't know, conceptual content to it in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, so that's kind of the move I made, maybe out of simple-mindedness, of like putting the social meaning kind of things and this expressive meaning into one basket, because they, and into one mechanism thereby, because they just seem to behave the same with respect to these tests that sort of relate to the theory that we have here, maybe. Especially like where it's really then about the pronunciation of these. I mean, this is always a bit easier, obviously, for the sort of classical social meaning things, because they, I mean, except for negative concord, what social linguists mostly focus on is variation between two, just like a slight phonetic variation. And yeah, and then, yeah, I don't know, these other cases there, I see that there's some work, and there might be some kind of, I mean, maybe like with like, I mean, especially these insertion cases, like the goddamn insertion there already, it's a bit weirder to say, well, you know, decide to just stick in a word. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of like inserting a gesture or something, and possibly might do that as well.
Okay, we have a couple other
Yeah.
questions. We have a question from Vesta.
Hello, hi.
Hi, Vesta.
So very simple case to help me understand something. If I call someone a derogatory term, like calling a dog köta, yeah, what am I forming in my yeah, meaning component? It's just one word. There wasn't anything to merge, apparently.
Well, what is no, maybe
I think
in
it's
some cases,
interesting.
yeah. I mean, you have a that's an. I mean, I would have to say, you have formed the dog concept in your meaning component.
Yeah.
I guess, and then you realize it as Köter. Well, I mean, this Köter is a little bit. I mean, of course, there are derogatory terms like asshole or whatever you would. Those you use frequently, I guess, in this way. With Köter, I find it a bit hard. I mean, I'm a bit bothered by this because usually I would like these thoughts to be also propositional, or I mean, in the examples that I have usually in mind.
Yeah.
So this is a bit not quite, so, but it takes it. I mean, in some way, this social meaning component, of course, well, this that also works independent of any concept in your mind. I mean, this when like this teenager is dressed in a cool way. I mean, maybe at the time of getting dressed, she has some concept in her mind about I'm a cool person, but then I mean that it at least it's not a constant thing, and they do seem to separate. Well, there's also, I mean, there is a neurological condition that people can just seem to be pronouncing these curse words and not like pronouncing anything else anymore. So I assume that there's some kind of separate thing.
Yep. Thank you.
We have a clarification question from Michaela and then Sophie.
It's just I can skip. Let others ask their question.
Okay, then a question from Sophia.
I can read the question. Or...
You want to read that, Uli?
So the question by Sophia Burnett is: so you see your model as having a circuitous property wherein the emotive insertion shifts the generation of thought from black box to a more superficial role. Not quite sure. I mean, what is a bit confused with it. I mean, I assume this is kind of emotive insertion or intrusion is really not the thought. That's not part of the thought, and it's some kind of other, maybe less conscious cognitive system, or not at least necessarily as conscious as a thought. And so I mean, it sort of assumption is that, I mean, for the most part, these two communication systems, or at least, I mean, often they work independently of one another. I mean, mostly the socio-emotive communication is like works with fashion and with, I don't know, body posture and whatever. I mean, the logical communication can also avail itself to these other modalities, as in like work by Philippe Schlenker and others have shown, but usually it sort of is more tied to the seems or well, maybe I shouldn't say anything, but I mean it often also comes comes with the verbal modality. I mean, because that has kind of this structure, and then, or I mean, in putting aside sign language anyway, and these, I mean, would and then that these two, to some extent, compete kind of for basically bandwidth in this channel, and to some extent influence each other, and then this has to be, yeah, hopefully, I mean, it has to be limited in some way, and hopefully that the way this is constrained will be better understood. But yeah, that's where we stand. I don't know whether I answered that question, but okay, good. Thank you for your response there. So she said, okay, thank you in the chat. So thank you too.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions? Hyla, was there something you wanted to follow?
Yeah, I think I just a clarification in a way, in terms of understanding the structure and the generation of thought. So in conclusion, you said that the logical part is outside of the language, and I didn't quite understand that claim. So if I understand you correctly, so you have the as it were, it is part of the thought, those two components, the logical and the socio-emotive, so that in both together they merge and compress and produce this, you know, you pick up this word that as it were has the connotation, the probably what David Beaver and Jason would call resonance, this sort of emotive or social resonance. So although are the two part of the thought, and then you would include as part of this socio-emotive other multimodal language, like let's say sarcastic intonation when you, or things like that. Is you sort of, yeah, you have this multi, as it were, yeah, you as a speaker, you pick up multiple channels that would convey the information, impress the as it were, the piece of language you send as an input. Is that the idea? So that's what happens in the speaker, and then on the other side of the hearer, you would have a sort of whatever the most efficient inference system that the hearer could avail to by doing this kind of intertwining of those different kinds of multi-channels. One would be language, one would be this socio-emotive intonation or whatever other paralinguistic cues that we have. Is that the picture? And in particular, like what is that correct? Did I get you right that you say that the thought would be generated by using this merging these two different or multiple channels basically, but somehow meaning is first. So what is the meaning first? Is it?
I mean, there was a meaning first was this particular sort of used as a contrast to the mainstream approach where syntactic structure is
Right.
first, or in like Montague grammar, it's actually what they call surface form. So the written form is kind of first, and then they map that to something, or and that's so. And I mean the addition here then was to say, well, but if we have these, I mean, so we do have some kind of logical meaning first, but it seems to be like not capable, that model as it as it stands without this socio-emotive kind of component that I try to speculate about to capture something like I mean it's on the maybe as you suggested, looking at the hero side is actually clearer there, and then like if I say to like if I this is I don't know, you are more expensive, like, but if I say to somebody I dislike you, that's not as hurtful and so on as an immediate as when I say you're an asshole, and that kind of difference, I mean, seems to be, I mean, maybe it's just a difference of degree, but it seemed to me also because of these kind of pot style of type of data, and what also social linguists assume that this is just a meaning of a different nature, and kind of in this more looking maybe here, so more biological in the individual perspective that I'm coming from, it's that sort of relates more to these other systems that you find in the animal world as well, where dominance relations and mating relevant properties are communicated in some other way without in animals that don't have any sort of, as far as I know, any other any linguistic communication going on. So that's kind of was the attempt here, or is the attempt here? Okay.
Okay, great. So that takes us to the end of our time slot. I guess anybody is welcome to chat further informally for the next 10 minutes while we all take a break of whatever sort is necessary. And then we'll pick up with the next talk at 10 after. Thank you again, Uli.
Yeah, thank you.
So Anton, do you want to test your slides, or are you fine?
Sorry?
If you want to test your slides.
Yeah, I want
But
to.
I'm sure.
Where do I share here? Share screen.
Yeah.
And screen.